So hyperinflammation is you're very familiar with the concept of autoimmunity and auto-inflammation. These three are the own goals of our immune and inflammatory response. Now, I think we should try to learn to use this word in the proper way. And I think Bruno gave an example. He was talking about an auto-inflammatory disease with an adaptive immunity component in there. So Still's disease is not a pure auto-inflammatory disease. And we had a fight during the recommendation meetings on the wording here. Hyperinflammation is something that we have become very well aware and then burst during COVID. As you well know, it's an activation of innate and adaptive immunity in response to a reasonable stimulus to do so. That's different from autoinflammation. If you have CAPS, an NLRP3 mutation, and you get inflammation because of cold exposure, that's a trivial trigger. You should not get inflammation when you're exposed to cold, like today or yesterday. In hyperinflammation, it gets excessive. It involves both innate and adaptive immunity, for example, in response to a viral infection, but this response becomes excessive and leads to damage to the host. Usually, hyperinflammatory syndromes are lethal if they're not treated because they get out of control. Now, this is where we started using this word. That was in 2019, right before COVID. End of 2019, right before COVID, in which there was a group of people who tried to put together a number of points to consider at the early stage of diagnosis and management of what we decided to call HLH-MAS, because we didn't know how to call it, and there was that definition of hyperinflammation. These are the names of the people that were involved in there. And there was one thing that I like to stress clinically, it's the recognizable clinical pattern. Now, there is not one single clinical sign or one single laboratory parameters that allows you to make a diagnosis of an hyperinflammatory syndrome, but there is a pattern. That's the fever, the splenomegaly, the low counts, not necessarily low, just inappropriately low for the degree of inflammation, organ dysfunction, usually liver, you can see easily, coagulopathy with intravascular activation of the coagulation well before getting to DIC. There is often CNS. The hallmark here is increased or rising ferritin, and there is inflammation. Hyperinflammation doesn't mean a lot of CRP. That's a lot of inflammation. Hyperinflammation means all these things together, or at least some of them, and they have to be evaluated over time. What are we talking about? Pediatricians know these things because we have familial monogenic HLH due to the cytotoxicity defect, but there are a number of other diseases that we are becoming familiar with that are all characterized by this recognizable pattern of hyperinflammation. Yep, I got it. Just ferritin, it's always there. You can't have hyperinflammation without ferritin. It's in all the different sets of criteria. Ferritin is there. So when you suspect HLH-MAS hyperinflammation, measure ferritin. If you can't find it elevated, do it again. We had a case a couple of weeks ago of familiar HLH flying in from Dubai. They suspected HLH. Ferritin was normal, okay? Just a matter of waiting. She got worse, unfortunately, and ferritin, just spiked up to the thousands ranges. So just when you suspect, just repeat it. As Bruno mentioned, don't look for the first H of HLH, hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. That H is wrong because 50% of the patients with hyperinflammation do not have hemophagocytosis at their first bone marrow. So don't do the bone marrow to look for hemophagocytosis. Do the bone marrow because you need to exclude malignancies and bone marrow diseases. It's like tossing your coin, so don't do it. If you look at the different criteria, the pattern is all over there. Okay, I'm not sure you can read this slide, but you see the red squares pointing to the issues, the items of the pattern I alluded to. They're all in the different criteria. So again, the criteria are useful, but not the way you make the diagnosis. The way you make the diagnosis is by recognizing the pattern. And the nuance of the expert us for Still's disease are indicated in this criteria. The threshold for low platelet is well within the normal limit. It's just inappropriately low compared to the level of inflammation of this patient. The same is true for fibrinogen. So you don't have to wait to get these things very low. You just look at the trend. And indeed, in the statistical work that led to this consensus criteria in 2016, there was some work on the trends over time. And if you want to be an experienced clinician in early diagnosis MAS, which does make a difference in terms of outcome, you want to look at the changes over time in ferritin, so do it again. Platelet count and liver involvement are the three drivers of the trends over time when your patient is evolving into MAS, before full-blown MAS. Now, MAS has three presentations during Still disease. Classic MAS at any time during the course of the disease, MAS at onset, and persistent relapsing, smothering, whatever you want to call it, MAS. So they pose three different challenges from a diagnostic point of view. Classic MAS, we controlled the disease with IL-1 and IL-6 inhibitor, but we didn't get rid of MAS, and this is very clear. This is just one column of that table that Bruno showed it to you, in which you clearly see that there is MAS on IL-1 and IL-6 inhibitors. Maybe the incidence is a little lower than expected, but this is because we control the disease, but it's still there. So you have to be able to recognize it and be aware of the dog. These IL-1 and IL-6 inhibitors do change a little bit the clinical presentations of MAS, less fever, less ferritin, increase. So be careful. The 2016 criteria were actually generated with patients that were not receiving, real patients that were not receiving, however, IL-1 or IL-6 inhibitors. So this is an analysis that was done later. So be aware of the possible nuances. This is the table that Bruno showed to you, and that's why MAS at onset is a challenge. MAS at onset of Still's disease is a challenge because this is what you are faced with, the long list of diagnoses, and you need to be fast because while you can, take a little bit of time, a couple of weeks or 3 weeks to make your diagnosis of Still disease, you can't wait 3 weeks to treat an MAS patient. So you have to make sure that you run through the diagnosis as quickly as you can. The bone marrow aspirate is useful for the differentials, not for anything else. Now, recurrent relapsing smolder MAS is a therapeutic challenge because this is one example. I talk about this patient later. This is a patient with, chronic relapsing liver and bone marrow, and then full-blown MAS over several years. That was very difficult to treat. And you can imagine they get everything you have to try to treat this patient. So from pathogenesis to biomarker and treatments. So this is something that we designed together with Alexei Grom, who is an MA expert from Cincinnati, trying to think about the layer of pathogenesis. So there is a genetic predisposition to hyperinflammation. There is a background inflammatory activity, Still's disease being a typical example, and there is a trigger. And very often these hyperinflammation syndrome are triggered by viral infection, for example. So once you get here, then you are in trouble because this is a vicious circle, self-perpetuating vicious circle. Again, the monogenic disease are a very good way to learn the pathway. I'm just looking at the two of you, okay? Because I think we should think in terms of pathway, pathogenic pathway, rather than, etiology, not necessarily, but the etiology for monogenic disease helps you getting to knowing what's going on. Obviously, monogenic diseases are much rarer than the other ones. So one thing we have learned is that since 2 decades, actually, is that in perforin deficient mice who have HLH, familiar HLH, triggered by a viral infection, they recapitulate exactly what happens in humans. If you neutralize interferon gamma, the mice get significantly better. Essentially, they survive, and death or alive is a good outcome. And over the years, we have learned that if you have an impaired cytotoxicity and you cannot kill your target cells, you become overactivated. You produce lots of interferon gamma. These interferon gamma activates macrophages. You never die of infection, because these children do not die of infection, they die because of the cytokine storm that is generated by the overactivation of cytokines, of macrophages. So we know now that a genetic defect in cytolytic pathway can bring you directly into the circle by activating T cells, leading to interferon gamma overproduction and to the production of a number of other cytokines. If you look in animal models, you find several others that in turn activates the circle. We also have learned that genetic predisposition to macrophage hyperresponsiveness can lead to entering the same vicious circles. And this is actually due to monogenic IL-18opathies. We have to learn to say this, IL-18opathies. It took me a couple of years. So these are the prototypic disease, the NRAC4 inflammasome gain of function mutation, and the C-terminal mutation in CDC42. They have a feature. They produce tons of IL-18. Unstimulated macrophages from these humans being produce huge amount of IL-18, and when they are stimulated, they can't get any higher than that. They are already at full speed. And IL-18 is known to induce interferon gamma. And the story is actually that if you measure ferritin in this patient, and then you look at CXCL9 levels, which is a proxy of interferon gamma production, then there is a tight correlation showing that a lot of IL-18 induces activation of interferon gamma, and in turn, this is important in increasing the biomarker of MAS, which is ferritin. This is going to appear in January 24 on Nature Reviews of Rheumatology, and it talks about the monogenic, but also the polygenic IL-18opathies. And Scott Canna makes the point that systemic JIA, I said, did I say it? I did. Still's disease is actually a polygenic IL-18opathy, particularly lung disease patients with Still disease are. Now, Stills, we already talked about IL-18, another cytokine that really, move you into MAS is IL-6, which is a key cytokine. And there are a couple of papers that I'm not going through showing that if you actually trigger IL-6 transgenic mice with, LPS or poly-IC, mimicking a bacterial or viral infection, these mice develop MAS and they die. Okay, so again, a lot of IL-6 predisposes to the development of MAS, but again, lots of interferon gamma, and you see here a level of interferon gamma and CXCL9, mRNA level in the liver of these IL-6 overexpressing mice triggered with infections. And if you neutralize interferon gamma, the mice gets better. So again, IL-6 predisposes to something that looks like MAS in the mice, which are not humans. Let me now switch to lung disease. Why I switched to lung disease from MAS and interferon gamma? Because I think that's something that has to do one with each other. So this is something we have become more and more aware of. The United States, this apparently appeared earlier than in Europe and is typically a high fatality lung disease involving very young patients. These are the main association of these patients. Most patients with HJA lung disease have a history of MAS. They have higher ferritin during the course of the disease, and they may have very high level of IL-18, markedly high level of IL-18. And the story is in the lung of an infiltrate predominantly of CD4 T cells in the interstitium, together with the accumulation in the alveolar space of alveolar proteinosis, essentially. IL-18 is very high in the BAL, as well as genes induced by interferon gamma are very high in the tissue of these patients. Again, suggesting that, T cells overexpressing interferon gamma, CD4 T cell overexpressing interferon gamma may be important. This is a peculiar animal model generated a few years ago in Japan, and we have studied that model, and it really looks like this is the case. Tibet, which is the driver of CD4 Th1 differentiation. If Tibet is overexpressed in T cells, you get too many Th1. These Th1, for some reason, get into the lung, and the Tibet overexpressing mice die of very quickly of a lung disease that is really very similar to the Still disease lung disease. And it's always interferon gamma and CXCL9 in the lung being overexpressed. So the overall feeling here is that there is a group of patients, probably a young age, but we have seen also patients in their early adolescence, which often have MAS, which is often recurrent or chronic or smoldering, as they like to say. Many of these have, this anaphylaxis-like reaction to biologic, more to tocilizumab than to canakinumab, but some have had to anakinra in our hand. We have one patient with severe anaphylaxis-like to anakinra. They may have a non-typical rash, more pruritic. Many of these patients have eosinophilia from the start of the disease, and 1501 is really overrepresented in this population. I'll just show you the data now. Very high level of IL-18. We have collected data in Europe through Claudia Bracaglia in my group, she's the leader of the MAS SGA working party, can say SGA here, working party in the Pediatric Rheumatology European Society. And we have now 50 or 70 cases, almost 70 cases in Europe, prevalence as high as 2 to 5% of patients. Now, this is the B115 data that I was alluding to. You see that overall it's probably around 20 to 25% in stills, standard stills. However, if you have what they call DRESS, and I say we should never call it DRESS, or what we would like to call lung disease patients, you see the incidence is around 80%. Now, that makes a difference, okay? So it must be important, must be relevant, and must tell us something. Look, the history we can say, I like to think, and I'm not going to go into that too much because of the sake of time. How much time do I have, Alexander? I got
around 5 minutes.
Okay, okay. So, DRESS hypothesis, so reaction to IL-1 and IL-6. The implication is avoid the drug. There are a number of data which are not consistent with this hypothesis. There are a number of data which is consistent with the hypothesis that we skew TH development, and we have to modify treatment. That's why we are advocating T cells immunosuppressants. Now, this is just the vicious circle part of the schema we looked at before. And I think you can understand what are going to be the biomarker and the treatment very quickly. Biomarker, activated CD8 positive T cells, 2 different studies from Cincinnati and from us, little difference, but the overall thing is that if you compare this population of activated T cells with either activated SGIA, because that was the use, or sepsis or other diseases, the area under the curve is just unrealistic. It's very high. So it's trivial flow cytometry protocol. Everybody with a cytometry should do it. It's very easy, and we use it routinely now. It's not perfect. No, it's not perfect. The other thing we use is CXCL9 that we showed 6 years ago to be 7 now, to be associated with parameters of severity of MAS, but not elevated during active disease, Still's disease. You see CXCL9 elevated all over the board in MAS during SGIA, in infection-associated HLH, or in familiar HLH. However, IL-18 is clearly more on this side. So it tells you where are you getting into that vicious circle. But CXCL9 is a marker, is a proxy of interferon gamma production. There are other papers that have been done. Now I went back that I'm going to skip. So 2 biomarkers, activated CD8 positive T cells and CXCL9. They are becoming more and more routinely doable in several instances. Treatment, we can inhibit IL-1, we all do it. No trials, no data, no nothing, but we are all very familiar with doing it. Usually high dose IV, 5 to 15 milligram per kilogram per day, does not interfere with differential diagnosis at onset, and therefore it's a very good instrument, and it's safe, very safe. This is the data from a post-hoc analysis in the sepsis trial with anakinra. In this study, they used 48 milligram per kilogram per day, 48 milligram per kilogram per day for several days when there was no effect, okay? However, 10 years later, somebody realized there might have been patients with hyperinflammatory sepsis in those, and they were identified by increase in liver function test, ALT, and increase in D-dimer, coagulation, intravascular activation of coagulation. If you take this subgroup, then the difference is very obvious. Okay, the survival is increased by almost 100%. So this is very important. Emapalumab is an approach, again, targeted therapy. This is what has been used in the world. Unfortunately, emapalumab is not approved in Europe. I'm going to say yet. In animal models, neutralizing gamma works for everybody, whether it's primary, secondary, degranulation defect, infection-associated, auto-inflammation associated, it works for every mice. We have done a trial, which is an open-label trial, a single-arm trial in patients who had failed high-dose glucocorticoids in the context of SGRA or ROST stills. You neutralize very efficiently CXCL9 with emapalumab. That's a proxy of the biological effects of emapalumab in all patients. We invented the efficacy outcome, which was MAS remission as defined here, essentially no sign and symptoms and normalization of all laboratory parameters. This is median time to first MAS remission, which was 25 days. 13 out of 14 achieved MAS remission. You see ferritin going down very quickly and the AST going down very quickly. And also glucocorticoids dose. Glucocorticoids were tapered very quickly from a median dose in the weekly preceding emapalumab of 15 milligram per kilogram down to 0.5. And I'd like to mention that at week 2, it was already significantly decreased down to less than 2 milligram per kilogram per day. Safety was not an issue. We can discuss this maybe if you want. There were a few CMV-related events, which was surprising because CMV is not something you would expect neutralizing emapalumab. Anyway, you should monitor a patient for a viral infection. So IL-18 is a target. Yeah, we don't have the ideal drugs yet. Tadekinig has been used. It's a recombinant IL-18 binding protein, but I think the company is in trouble. MAS825 is a Novartis, and Novartis is not in trouble, as you can expect. It's a bispecific antibody that neutralizes IL-1 and IL-18 with the other arm. And the idea being that if you neutralize both, you're being more effective than neutralizing one of the two. We believe that this is potentially useful in persistent relapsing MAS and lung disease patients. And there are a few examples here and there. Here is the case with recurrent MAS and LD and lung disease with Still disease. You still see these are platelet count going up and down. So this patient had MAS episodes while on tadekinig. However, it was much more manageable. They were able to decrease the steroid dose a little, not to create a great satisfaction. And it went a little better, eventually went to bone marrow transplantation, it's fine. This is a case from, I think it's from Ed Behrens, which is in Philadelphia now. Again, a patient with refractory SGRE-associated lung disease has several MAS. This is the burden of treatment before MAS825, and it withdrew everything, is fine, his lung function improved over 6 months of treatment, I think there was. This is the patient I showed to you before. Very difficult patient. He responded to emapalumab, but eventually she relapsed after either a few weeks or a few months. We tried for almost 1 year to give emapalumab to this patient. She was fine. However, she relapsed again, so she went into MAS825. 6 months later, she looks like this. So that's great. No other treatment, and everything is normal. And there is a trial on monogenic IL-18opathy with MAS825, which is CD42 and LRC4 and CRIP now, and we hope to have results soon. And there will be a trial in patients with recurrent relapsing MAS and lung disease. So this is my summary. Clinical, think about the pattern, ferritin measure and remeasure, hemophagocytosis not needed. That age is wrong. Nosography, nosology. That age is wrong, and we can't change it, apparently. Recognition, biomarkers for early identification, activated CD8 and serum CXCR9 in the context of Stills, then IL-18 is useful, and targeted treatment approach. And I did not on purpose talk about JAK inhibitor, which we can discuss, IL-1 interferon gamma and IL-18. And I'd like to thank my group. The one person that really works on MAS is Claudia Bracaglia, which is right here in the picture. That's the one. Okay, that's Claudia. That's our first Christmas party post-COVID. Thank you very much for your attention.